Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Caveney and I will be moderating today's presentation. Before we begin, just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be sent out following today's discussion. If you do have any questions for our presenter, please feel free to enter them into the questions box and we'll do our best to answer following the presentation. So I would like to introduce today's speaker. Our speaker today is Carrie Nichols, who is the Business Development Director for Eurofins Food Chemistry Testing in Des Moines, Iowa. Carrie has over 11 years of experience in laboratory testing services, specializing in pet and animal nutrition, with emphasis in areas of food safety, regulatory compliance, and nutritional analysis. She is engaged in multiple leading organizations, frequently attending key industry functions to stay at the forefront of emerging trends and developments. All right, Carrie, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy day to join us for this morning's webinar. As Jennifer mentioned, my name is Carrie Nichols. I am the Vertical Business Development Director for Pet Food and Animal Nutrition for Eurofins US Food Testing here in North America. So I am based out of what I will refer to as our pet food hub, or sort of our center of excellence for nutritional testing in pet products, which is the Nutrition Analysis Center in Des Moines. So in order to just make sure that we keep our bandwidth good, I'm going to go ahead and cut my camera here and move forward with our presentation on dietary fiber in pet food. So today I intend to cover a few things at a somewhat high level. So we're going to start with what dietary fiber is. Then we'll talk about how dietary fiber has become an important topic of discussion in pet food through AAFCO's pet food label modernization, what each method quantifies, as well as finally considerations for selection of a dietary fiber method on finished products or ingredients. Let's jump right in. So what is dietary fiber? Dietary fiber is a non-digestible carbohydrate that can be further categorized by either physical properties or biological properties. Unlike digestible carbohydrates such as sugars and starches, which, as the name entails, are able to be digested by our body and provide energy, dietary fiber is not fully digested. So dietary fiber does have a lot of beneficial contributions in our physiological digestive process, however. So the first thing we often think of when it comes to dietary fiber is gastric emptying, moving our food from point A all the way through exit in our digestive tract. However, dietary fibers can also support our gut health through fermentation of the digestive tract microbiome. So those microbes in the digestive tract can utilize certain forms of dietary fibers for fermentation. Dietary fibers can be broken down into a few categories. So high molecular weight dietary fibers, these are your traditional soluble and insoluble fibers, and these are the most commonly measured and prevalent fibers that we see. Then we also see low molecular weight dietary fibers and resistant starches. Each of these will be outlined at a high level in the following slides. Comparing soluble versus insoluble dietary fibers, we're thinking about dietary fiber really in this context from a physical property perspective. So again, we're usually thinking soluble and insoluble. If you add soluble dietary fiber to water, it will dissolve into a solution and oftentimes form a gel. So a visual example would be if you added pectin into water. When you add the pectin into the water and you stir it, it's going to form a gel. The same is true for many dietary supplements that can be stirred into water and fully dissolved, though they may not be immediately forming a gel that's visibly present. So a lot of times if we take those dietary supplement powders, we put them into a water to make it drinkable, they fully dissolve, but the water still looks like water, and we're able to consume the fiber in that fashion. Soluble dietary fiber attracts water, like I mentioned, forms gels, and through that gelling process, it really helps promote satiety. So that feeling of fullness, that feeling that our appetite has been satisfied. It also helps to potentially regulate cholesterol levels in the body, as well as supporting the digestive microbiome. Biologically speaking, in general, soluble dietary fiber is fermentable by the microbes present in the digestive tract, but this is not always true. So again, just generally speaking, that is accurate, but it's not always true. When we think about insoluble dietary fibers, they do not behave in the same way that I just described. So consider a cell wall structure. Think visually about a cell wall structure. That's not something that would be binding with water or forming any type of a solution with water in any capacity. Insoluble dietary fibers are not going to be fermentable by digestive microbes. Thinking about examples, so these lists are not all encompassing, of course, but we wanted to just high level highlight what some examples of dietary fiber sources would be. Soluble fibers, again, knowing that these form gels, things like carrageenan, gums, soluble pectins, and so on. Cereal beta glucans can also be considered in this category of soluble dietary fiber, but we also see beta glucans contributing insoluble dietary fiber in some instances too. So I wanted to make sure to call that out on this slide because the different contributions of beta glucans from beta glucan sources yield different soluble versus insoluble dietary fiber contents. On the insoluble dietary fiber side, again, think cell wall structure. We have lignin, cellulose, those yeast beta glucans, and other similar contributors. In evaluating ingredient sources that can be contributors to these fibers, your soluble dietary fibers and insoluble dietary fibers, all of these are generally plant source, plant-based fibers. So soluble dietary fiber can be found in oats and oatmeal, apples, carrots, sweet potatoes, flaxseed, and many other fruits and vegetables and plant sources. Insoluble dietary fiber is often observed in kale, fruit and vegetable skins. So think of like your tomato pumice, that type of an ingredient, as well as brown rice. Again, these are just examples. There are plenty of others that are contributing these. But what I do want to make sure we understand is that they're not usually just contributing one source or another. It's usually kind of a mix of the two between these products. So they're not usually only contributing soluble dietary fiber or insoluble. There's often some level of a mix in these products, these whole food ingredient type materials. So another category of dietary fiber is resistant starch. And so there are several categories making up resistant starch, but I don't intend to cover them in detail today. I think that's a separate, more complicated topic. Similar to the last slide, sources can be rice and potatoes that have been cooked and cooled, beans, oats, wheat, plantains, though we know plantains aren't a super common pet product ingredient in other foods. So when starch is digested and broken down, typically it's breaking down into glucose. Resistant starch is different as a carbohydrate in that it does not get digested in the small intestine in this fashion. So therefore, it does not impact glucose levels in the body in the same fashion as regular starches. Our resistant starches are fermented in the large intestine by microbes that can have benefit to the body. As such, they can have prebiotic properties. But again, I think it's important to note here that RS1, so resistant starch 1, and RS2 can be lost in various processes as mentioned previously. So like cooking or even chewing, those can be lost in those processes. RS4 and RS5 are usually a high topic of conversation, but we don't intend to deep dive those issues today. The final category of dietary fibers we will discuss were historically referred to as low molecular weight dietary fibers. This is a newer concept in fiber analysis, but again, previously, and we'll talk about it more in the methods, they were referred to as low molecular weight dietary fibers. More recently, however, these fibers have been referred to as SDFS, so soluble dietary fiber soluble is what that stands for. The reason they're referred to in this way is the physical properties do not always correlate perfectly to structural characteristics like molecular weight. The former labeling of low molecular weight dietary fibers really refers to structure, but the newer labeling refers to these being soluble in 78% alcohol from an analytical perspective. These fibers are also sometimes referred to as non-digestible oligosaccharides, and these fibers are namely affiliated with their impact as prebiotics for digestive microbes. These fibers are also shorter chain carbohydrates comparatively to their high molecular weight counterparts. Examples of these fibers are inulin, fructooligosaccharides, which are also known as FOS, galactooligosaccharides, also known as GAS, and polydextrose. So those are all very common examples of this category of fibers. In terms of whole food ingredient sources, though, examples would be chicory root for a contribution of inulin, and then other sources would be bananas, barley, kale, those type of materials. So we've learned a lot already about dietary fibers, and now that we know more about those and the ingredients that contribute them, in this next section, I intend to discuss dietary fiber as it relates to pet food label modernization. Prior to the Association of American Feed Control Officials Pet Food Label Modernization implementation, so AAFCO's PFLM is the abbreviation, guaranteed analysis was the standard minimum nutrient information for pet food labels. Guaranteed analysis in terms of fiber claims required crude fiber to be listed. So we did not have dietary fiber. Long before the PFLM change was approved by AAFCO, the question was really raised, how can we make labels more relevant and understandable for consumers? So many years of discussion between regulators, veterinarians, nutritionists, and industry professionals led to the conclusion that crude fiber is really not the most relevant measurement for pets. It only determines the insoluble high molecular weight fibers, and we know that as we've discussed prior to this slide, that there are other fibers that we might want to be considering as well. So fast forwarding to the current state, the AAFCO model bill now lists dietary fiber as required on pet food product labels. So this is inclusive of complete diets, treats, toppers, mix-ins, and pet food supplements. Moving through this presentation, again, we now know dietary fiber is a form of carbohydrate, which is why on labels, we're seeing dietary fiber as a subgroup of total carbohydrates. So it's listed directly under total carbohydrates with a slight indentation. This change made conversation around determining the most appropriate, widely applicable method for determination of dietary fiber in a lab setting. You know, we had to have that conversation and understand what is going to be the most appropriate method that we're going to recommend to pet food manufacturers to measure their products for dietary fiber. With regard to that discussion, there was a lot of conversation and thought that went into this. AAFCO's Lab Methods and Services Committee spent a very large amount of time and effort tackling the topic of making a recommendation for a method. Some of the considerations around which method is most widely appropriate, some of the considerations rather were around which method is most widely appropriate for the vast majority of products. So what is going to be applicable or relevant to the majority of products being tested, but also what was the most practical to implement. When we talk about practicality and implementation, we're really thinking about what capabilities do many labs currently have? What are the general testing capacity capabilities for these specific methods? But then also, again, what types of fibers are most commonly present in pet food products? With all of these things considered, AOAC 991.43 was a very good fit across the board. It should be noted that this is a recommendation, not a requirement. There are definitely circumstances where other methods may be more appropriate and should absolutely be considered. So there's a recommended method, but what about the others? What about anything outside of AOAC 991.43? Again, my goal today is not to go into all of the technical details of each method, but rather the intention for me is to help us understand what is being quantified in practical use applications for each method. Again, I won't cover every single example, but I think by the end of this presentation from a very high level, hopefully everyone is confident in what we're measuring with these methods and how they may be applied to ingredients. So during the next few slides, hopefully it gives an opportunity to reflect on any ingredients that are being used in your products that might fall outside of the scope of AOAC 991.43 based on the explanations here. There are a lot of options for dietary fiber measurements. I've listed some in sequential order here from oldest to most current method in terms of, again, AOAC 995 through 2022.01. So this is not all encompassing of every dietary fiber method that exists. It's just kind of a high level list of commonly utilized or ones that we get frequent inquiries about. Oftentimes, these methods may also be referred to by a name as well. So I do just want to keep that in the back of our minds here too. So AOAC 985.29 may sometimes also be referred to as the Prosky method. And then AOAC 2009.01 is also referred to as the McCleary method for those who helped develop those methods. So keep in mind when we're looking through these methods specifically that resistant starch is listed out, but resistant starch is not a separately quantified or reported component for any of these methods. I want to make sure that that is very clear. There are differences in each method's capability of quantifying resistant starches as part of the dietary fiber discussion. So I did just want to make sure that we called that out. Starting at the beginning of the list with the most basic of the methods, we have AOAC 985.29. This is also referred to as the Prosky method. This method is not as widely or commonly used in present day as it's basically been replaced by AOAC 991.43. There are some facilities that still use this method, but for the most part, we're really seeing adoption of 991.43 and labs using that method. So this method particularly, it does not capture all of the forms of dietary fiber that could be present. So it does not quantify most resistant starches, with the exception being RS3. It does quantify that as part of the high molecular weight dietary fibers. And it also does not quantify our low molecular weight soluble dietary fibers. So the things like inulin, fructooligosaccharides, those are not quantified in this method. When you look at a report for this method, you're only going to get one result. It's going to be a total dietary fiber result only. It does not break it down into any further categorization of those fibers. Next, we have AOAC 991.43. Again, very commonly used method, and it's important though to just understand that the utilization is really ingredient dependent. So this method is also referred to as the Lee method, but again, very, very commonly used. Similar to the last method, it does not capture all forms of dietary fiber, in that it does not measure low molecular weight soluble dietary fibers. So again, we're not capturing our fructooligosaccharides, we're not capturing inulin, we're not capturing polydextrose with this particular method. It does quantify resistant starch 3, and it does quantify the high molecular weight forms of dietary fibers. The difference between this method and the last method is that this method can report total dietary fiber, so that is going to be your components of your high molecular weight. So a TDF for high molecular weight components. Again, we're not looking at low molecular weights, but it can also separately report out insoluble dietary fiber and your high molecular weight soluble dietary fibers, which is oftentimes just referred to simply as soluble dietary fiber or SDF. So again, you'll see a total, but you could also see the insoluble and soluble high molecular weight dietary fibers broken out here. You do not see that in the method prior to this. Moving into methods that can quantify more of the resistant starches as well as the low molecular weight dietary fiber presence. I grouped these by similarity of the method in terms of what's reported and what's measured. So 2009.01 and 2017.16 both report the same fractions. So they both report a total dietary fiber result, which does include the low molecular weight soluble dietary fibers. These two methods also quantify more of the resistant starches as well. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then again, it also reports high molecular weight dietary fiber too. The main difference in 2009 and the 2017 methods are that the 2017 methods, again, they're reporting the same parameters, but there are some differences in what is being measured very slightly. So again, when we're comparing these two methods particularly, they're included together based on what they report. But I do just want to call out here that in the 2017.16 method, there is a slightly shorter incubation time and a different HPLC column used in the analysis. So both methods are reporting the same fractions or analytes, but the newer method also through the different column and the different incubation time is addressing issues of underestimation of low molecular weight dietary fiber components that the previous methods do not. So this method, 2017.16, also refers to the high molecular weight soluble dietary fiber as soluble dietary fiber precipitate, so SDFP. And it's labeled this way because when this component is introduced into aqueous ethanol, it forms a precipitate. Separately, 2017.16 also refers to our low molecular weight soluble dietary fiber as SDFS. Again, so unlike SDFP, the precipitate form, when SDFS, so soluble dietary fiber soluble, is introduced into aqueous ethanol, it remains soluble. So again, measuring and quantifying, reporting the same things more or less. Slight differences in how we refer to the fibers when we look at the methods. So I did just want to call that out because I think that can be a point of confusion when you see soluble dietary fiber precipitate instead of soluble dietary fiber. But that's the main difference here, is how we're referring to their behavior during the analytical method and when they're introduced into aqueous ethanol. Then looking at 2011.25 and 2022.01, again, we're quantifying the same for the total. When we're thinking about the total, we're quantifying the same analytes in terms of a total measurement as the previous two methods. But the main difference here is that we're able to split out and become more granular with these two methods than the former two. So AOAC 2011.25 is an extension or modification of 2009.01. 2022.01 is very similar to 2011.25, but again, similar to the last slide, we're observing some modifications that make it slightly different. So shorter incubation time again, different HPLC column used. Both methods are reporting the same fractions, but like with the last method, AOAC 2022.01 is addressing issues of underestimation of low molecular weight dietary fiber components that the previous methods do not. So the same is true for this method, also referring to soluble dietary fiber precipitate as SDFP or SDFP instead of just regular SDF. And then again, when we look at the low molecular weight fibers, those are referred to as soluble dietary fiber soluble again as well, or abbreviated to SDFS with that 2022.01 method. Again, so when we're thinking about what this is actually quantifying, it quantifies all of our high molecular weight dietary fibers, most forms of resistant starches, as well as the low molecular weight fiber sources, so inulin, fructooligosaccharides, those type of things. The difference here, again, as I mentioned, is that this can break it down into more granular data. So you'll have a report for your total dietary fiber. You'll have insoluble dietary fiber, which is this component right here. So high molecular weight insolubles. You'll have your soluble dietary fiber, which is this component. And then the other component that you'll see broken out separately is the low molecular weight soluble dietary fiber over here. So these items are all reported under the high molecular weights, and then the low molecular weight over here on the right is reported separately on its own. So I know that's a lot of very technical information about the methods and kind of what they do differently and similarly. But the final portion of the discussion today is really focused on circumstances when you may want to use a different method other than the recommended AOAC 991.43. So I went ahead and excluded AOAC 985.29 because it's really not as widely used. First and foremost, when it comes to finished product pet food, I've kind of touched on this earlier, but again, I want to reiterate, the Association of American Feed Control Officials, AAFCO, has recommended 991.43. We just heard a lot of great things about the more advanced methods. So again, touching on why are we not recommending, or why is AAFCO not recommending the more advanced methods instead? Again, from a practical perspective, 991.43 covers the majority of dietary fiber components within finished product pet food in most cases. When evaluating the implementation of dietary fiber, this method is much more easily accessible for manufacturers as most labs perform it routinely. So it's also more cost effective. We know that's important. It's less labor intensive and it takes less time to complete than other more advanced methods. Turnaround time is obviously important, so it's a little bit of a quicker method as well. The other thought process associated with the practicality is really the diet formulations in general. Most diets, you know, and when I say diets, I complete diets, mix-ins, toppers. We do know that there is an uptick in using functional ingredients for physiological benefits, especially those benefits that support gut microbiome, so prebiotic properties, but they're usually included at very low rates, sometimes even as low as 0.5% or less. So when we consider the analytical variability of a dietary fiber assay, that low of an inclusion rate in a finished product can more or less disappear with the analytical variability of the methods. So again, there are always exceptions to the rule. So pet supplements that deliver prebiotic fibers in significant quantities, that would be one where you maybe want to evaluate a different method. If you're making claims on pet health supplements around assays like inulin, fructooligosaccharides, those things, and the label requires dietary fiber, those are likely included at levels that should be tested with one of the newer methods. In our lab here in Des Moines, we perform the AAFCO 2011.25 method to routinely support label claims for products including inulin and similar. So in this particular slide, we see common fiber source ingredients and the methods that are most appropriate to measure them. So AAFCO 991.43 is good for measuring cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin, beta-glucans, soluble pectins, carrageenan, and psyllium in finished products, and for the most part, ingredients as well. We talked earlier on, many of these whole food ingredients like apples, tomato, pomace, carrots, those kind of ingredients are really appropriate to be analyzed with this method for accurate dietary fiber results. When we start looking at the low molecular weight soluble dietary fiber sources that can be introduced into a finished product, that's really where we need to be more mindful, and careful consideration needs to be made as to whether or not the inclusion rate is relevant to the dietary fiber measurement. So when you're thinking about how much, of these ingredients are included, either through a whole food type ingredient or otherwise, what that impact is going to be on a total dietary fiber value, and if you want to make sure that you're capturing those particular components or not. Again, we know that products can be largely variable in how they're formulated and what types of fibers might be present. So if this isn't something that you're confident in, we would absolutely encourage you to reach out to your lab, your trusted lab provider, and talk through the formula and evaluate the inclusion rate together and understand if you think that it's something that's high enough to need one of these newer methods, or if we really just need to look at 991.43. There's really a large caveat as well in terms of ingredient analysis across the above listed methods. So some ingredients simply do not work well with the fiber methods at high concentrations or pure levels. Psyllium is one of those ingredients. So when you introduce psyllium into certain aqueous solutions, it forms a gel, and that gel is very difficult to filter, meaning we cannot complete the analysis on that pure raw material. So even though these ingredients are listed in a specific category on this slide, again, this is really intentional around where do they fall in a finished product. For ingredients on their own, we just need to be mindful that any type of ingredient that will form a gel in an aqueous solution, so think chia seeds, flax seeds, gums, sugar mannins, those types of ingredients will run into the same issues I described as psyllium. They will form a gel, they will not be able to be filtered, and therefore cannot be completed properly for dietary fiber. So in finished products, usually a very small percentage of the total inclusion or total diet formulation. So it's really not problematic for us here. It's just those raw material ingredients. To wrap up today, to summarize, again, finished products with very low levels of inclusion of prebiotic fibers or other low molecular weight soluble dietary fibers can still be analyzed with AAFCO 991.43. But products that have more substantial inclusion rates or products that are making claims indicating significant portions of the makeup of the product is a prebiotic type fiber or low molecular weight type fiber, those should be analyzed with an appropriate method between the 4 options listed on the right-hand side. We need to keep that in mind that, the methods discussed in this presentation are reporting dietary fiber only. So if you're making direct claims for things like inulin, like fructooligosaccharides, like galactooligosaccharides, if you're making claims on those outside of a total dietary fiber value on a label, any of those claims, there are direct measurement methods available for those to support those claims directly. So with that, that kind of concludes what I was hoping to present to the group today, and appreciate your time.
Perfect. Thank you, Carrie. Excellent presentation, wonderful details, walking through all the different fiber method considerations. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat that I'll go ahead and ask. The first one, are there any other AAFCO requirements for fiber testing if a company is not using one of the AAFC methods listed?
That's a great question. So the main requirement is to ensure that products are labeled as accurately as possible for dietary fiber. If the lab you work with is utilizing a different method, it's the main thing here is just to understand what that specific method is actually quantifying and where there could be potential downfalls when it comes to your particular formulation. Dietary fiber, the other thing I would say about it is this should absolutely not be confused with crude fiber. If you approach a laboratory and you just say, hey, I just need fiber analysis, crude fiber is a really common request. So if they don't ask, it's very possible you might get a quote for crude fiber or they might apply crude fiber. So that's the other thing I would just say is be very intentional when you approach your laboratory and say, I need dietary fiber. And then if you want to have, additional discussion around the other methods, that would be a good option to do so at that time.
All right, perfect. Thank you. All right, one other question from the chat. What do I do if I'm unsure of what fiber method is most appropriate for my product?
Yeah, we run into this quite a bit, I think, because dietary fiber, while it's not a new concept, I think it's still a little bit new and fresh to a lot of individuals in animal nutrition. So if you're not confident, of course, our default answer is always going to be, please reach out to your trusted testing partner, have that conversation, have an open dialogue with them. Again, in finished products, it's a lot more straightforward for the most part, minus the exceptions we previously discussed. Ingredients, again, for the most part, 991.43 is appropriate, but if you're not confident, your testing partner should absolutely be able to talk through that information with you about your product specific ingredients. And from that point, you can work together to establish the best path forward in terms of method selection.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Carrie, so much for today's presentation. So much good information for the audience. And just wanted to also thank everyone who's attended. Please feel free to reach out with any questions, and we would be happy to connect further to discuss this important topic in pet food. This now will conclude today's presentation, and everyone have a wonderful day.